Hi, and welcome to Everything Digital Health. I'm Marcus Bohr. Going to share with you today some work I've been doing on clinical safety. So I am an NHS clinical safety officer, which means I've done a certain amount of training relating to clinical safety of health technology things. I'm going to talk through a presentation that I gave last week at the Let's Talk Digital conference. Those videos will be released at some point, but I just wanted to record this more directly with the slides up big, giving myself a little bit more time to sort of talk around some of the issues. So let's switch to the slides and crack on. So as I say, I was at Let's Talk Digital, which is an excellent digital health conference. It's quite a small conference. It's held usually in the sort of Cotswolds area of Great Britain, and it's run by a friend of mine, Mark Bailey, and a small team of helpers. It's got a nice, friendly feel, and it's very refreshingly devoid of those kind of corporate interests, very big sales pitch type things, and kind of central government announcement type things. It doesn't have any of those. It's got much more kind of grassroots stories from people who are doing some kind of digital work in a very local way. And it includes some of their success stories, some of the difficulties they've explored and sometimes conquered, sometimes not conquered. And it's a great conference to go to. So the next one will be around this time of year, sort of October 2026. Let's talk clinical safety. And this is really about making clinical safety just better. As I'll explore, the way that we do clinical safety is primarily a documentation approach. Like a lot of certifications in computer systems, like ISO 27001, for example, which is for sort of information security, it's about writing down your processes and hoping that your processes are good. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are. And I think with an excessive focus on documentation, you can forget to do the important things. And I'm as you probably know, as it's my channel, I'm a GP, or general practitioner, as I like to call myself. Very into open source. I'm a clinical safety officer. I work primarily for the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, but I work for other organisations as well. I run a lot of discourse forums, and the clinical safety work that I've done has been mainly with the Royal College of Paediatrics. Clinical safety should be better than this now. When we say clinical safety in an NHS and health tech context in the UK, we're referring to DCB 0129 and DCB 0160, which are data control board documents that were introduced as part of the Health and Social Care Act 2012. Actually, back in 2012, it was known as ISB, Information Standards Board. So these would be ISB 0129 and ISB 0160. But then they changed the name of the board, but the numbers of these documents, of course, stay the same. Long story short, these are primary legislation which said that in the Health and Social Care Act that the Secretary of State in the UK might want to make some information standards, or in this case, data control. And these ones are about digital clinical safety. In these standards, it talks about having a clinical safety officer. So that's a clinician who has had training in doing a review of clinical safety. And the two different documents, 0129 refers to manufacture of health IT systems. So if you are a supplier and you've made a platform for health tech, then it should have a clinical safety officer, and you produce a DCB 0129 clinical safety plan or clinical safety document. If you're implementing somebody else's software, then you'll take their 0129 case report, read it, and make your own implementation level report, because there are certain risks involved in a health IT system which can't be mitigated by the manufacturer because they require something to be done with, say, the end users. So those kind of risks get passed from the 0129 into the 0160. So that's the kind of background to all of this. Everybody who's a clinical safety officer goes on the course, and it's quite sensible stuff. Like, I found it quite interesting, and you learn about the kind of risks we're looking for, and you're using your clinical common sense really to sort of say, well, if this piece of information was wrong or was not presented to the user in the right way, that could make the user do the wrong thing with the patient and harm the patient, and that's a hazard. So you start thinking of everything as what is a hazard, and you have to track these hazards. And you have to have a system for how you track hazards, how you would act on hazards. All of that stuff is what goes into the documentation. So you go on your course. So far, so good. Now, on the course, you will start talking about clinical safety case reports and other pieces of documentation. And sadly, this is where I started to depart with the mindset of the current state of the art, is that everything is Word documents and Excel spreadsheets. So in this case, we've got a template which comes from the NHS digital website, or it's now NHS England, but it's the digital bit of that. And you fill in your organisation name, and you fill in published XX month 2017, which I presume is when these were last revised, these templates. And then we have a document file name and a directorate and a document reference and an owner and a director and an author. Now, this box here is version control, but it's being done in an 18th century way. We have much better ways of doing version control of documents now that don't tie you to using track changes in Word or a manual version control box on a document. I'm thinking about using the tools that your developers are using. So Git, for example, gives you version control. It also gives you a lot of insight into the authors of a document. And there are lots of ways you can start using those tools to create living clinical safety documentation, which is not a Word document. They also manage their hazards in an Excel spreadsheet. So when we're talking about a hazard, this is a single type of thing that could go wrong in your software. And then you give it a number here manually, and then you say what date it was added. Well, these are all things that can be done automatically, surely. And then you describe the hazard. That's the bit that humans get involved in. And then there's a whole load of these existing controls and initial risk assessment and things. And although on paper this is meant to be a very scientific exercise where you describe what things already control the risk that are happening and like what stops it getting worse, and you make a risk assessment, you say, how bad is this hazard right now? And then we can do some additional controls and we can bring that risk down a bit. And then you give it an owner and all that kind of stuff. Now, number one, front and center, Excel spreadsheets are just awful for handling text like this. It's incredibly dangerous. You only need to delete a row and you've lost a hazard. And it's easily done when your cat walks across the keyboard or something and that row's gone and as far as you're concerned, it didn't exist. And there's no real sort of way of noticing that error unless someone actually spots it. Lots of other things about, that a lot of this is what I call clinical safety theatre, because it looks like tremendously scientific, clever work. But actually what's happening here is you're pretending to assess the risk. But in general, what people often do is overestimate the risk a bit, so that in the initial risk assessment, it's a wide open goal for some terrible thing to happen. And then you can add some controls that bring that risk assessment down into an acceptable level. And then you put together the severity, the likelihood in a grid, you work out the risk that's resultant from that, and then you do something about the justification, like, can we go live with this level of risk? But a lot of it just does seem to be risk register theatre. And I'd much rather have some much more human interactions, discussions around each hazard. And that's one thing you cannot do in a spreadsheet. So you get to the end of this row, say somebody has an opinion about that row, that hazard. What are they going to do? Add their opinion in a little cell, in a column, and then somebody replies to that. So we need another column, and then there's a reply, and we're just going to keep on adding columns ad infinitum, going out, to the far east of this Excel spreadsheet. It's balmy. Stop doing it. There are better ways of doing this, and just like before, the software development circuit has us covered. They have had things called bug trackers for years, and there are lots and lots of options in the world of bug tracking, including just writing, having it in a forum or putting it in a text file or something. In my case, I used GitHub Issues, which is the bug tracker that sort of comes for free with GitHub. Lots of reasons to like GitHub, some reasons not to like GitHub, but in the end, all of the CodeForge type pieces of software, they all have some kind of bug tracker built in. Then you take your Word document and your Excel spreadsheet and you hide them in your SharePoint, and no one will ever look at them again. And this is where I have even more of a problem, because who's to ensure that things are done properly? Who's going to check that a clinical risk or a hazard has been mitigated to its maximum? The mitigation could be, we will add this X feature that mitigates it, and then that feature never gets built. How do you know that was solved then? There is no accountability without the transparency to be able to have other people check that the clinical systems are safe. And I think across the NHS now, we have the default by far is that clinical safety cases, clinical safety documentation, hazard logs are all just hidden within the organization. And it's very difficult to look at them. If, for example, if you were an end user and you work at your teaching hospital and you say, I want to see the hazard log for this, I would imagine you'd get pretty short shrift, and people would immediately be quite sensitive about it. They might be thinking, who is this guy? Why is he asking for our clinical safety case? What is he trying to prove, kind of thing? So I think the solution to this is just to be much more transparent about this stuff. So we need to be able to publish it. You might ask, well, are there any organisations within NHS, like historical ones, NHSX, NHS Digital, NHS England, Department of Health and Social Care, any of these got it nailed? And nope. When I worked at NHS Digital and England, essentially not seen anybody in any organisation that's using a sort of good system that does things like version control for you, that has automated what can be automated and slims down the crap so that you can focus on making things actually safer. And certainly none of them have got the transparency thing. What does the rest of the industry do? So, an NHS trust, well, in this case, what they do is they go onto the Digital Health Networks forum and they'll say, has anyone done a clinical safety case for this piece of software that I would like to use? Because probably someone else is already using that software. Surely they would have done a case. And sometimes you'll get a reply saying, yeah, I've done a case. And they'll say, oh yeah, email it to me. And they'll swap email addresses on a forum and email it to each other privately when they could have shared it on the forum with everybody else who's a clinical safety officer. There's only so much madness you can live with, right? So nobody is doing this right. There are consultancies that provide clinical safety stuff as a service. Of course, they're a little bit beholden to what their customers want them to do. So they can't necessarily just say, sorry, you're not having Word and you're not putting it in a SharePoint and hiding it. We're going to put it on the internet for you. I understand that, like a clinical safety consultancy is not really in a position to force the hand of the entire NHS. But they could be leading by example about better ways of doing it. Anyway, I think I've been through some of this stuff. Word is a terrible way to do the documentation. You're having to manually copy and paste your organization name and your clinical safety officer's name and things into a document. And yes, if you do all that, you'll end up with something that is a document. But you haven't really spent any time working on the safety at this point. You've just spent days messing around with the formatting of a document and that kind of thing. So, the version control tends to go to the dogs because you make a small edit and forget to go and update the box at the top and those kind of things. And you end up with a file system that has, version 1 brackets 2, and then the next file says version 1 brackets 2 brackets 2, square brackets final. And then below that, it'll be like, use this and stuff. That's not version control. Oh, that's what version control you do if you've never heard of version control. If we care about version control, we use the tools that our software developers are using because almost all of them are using Git. That means that if we used Git, we can kind of use the same systems as the software is being controlled with. And whether it's open source or closed source, it doesn't matter. The ability to kind of connect a safety improvement to the code that caused the safety improvement and be able to link from one to the other and say, yeah, this bit of change to the code is what made this more safe. That's really good because that means you can evidence when you've downgraded a risk. You haven't just made up the downgrade of risk. You can say this is the code change that actually created that safer piece of software. Having a document just discourages people from iterating because it feels like it's, that's done. It's in the SharePoint. Put a seal on it, never touch it. And like I say, it's a hard separation from the agile development process. Hazards are, really badly done in Excel. So, it's not designed for text. You can easily accidentally balk the whole thing. Very difficult to do commenting. You can't share very easily your hazards. Like every organization that starts filling in a hazard log for a piece of software, quite possibly starting from scratch, even though there might be 50 other organizations with the same software who have all identified each, 10 different hazards. Now, they might be the same 10, but even so, it would be nice to get the starter pack, wouldn't it, with the 10 in it that says, these are the 10 that all the rest of the NHS has already identified. Can you think of a number 11? That's iteration, and that's like sharing and developing the clinical safety work, much better than what we're currently doing, which I think is, frankly, it's a bit lame. I'd like to see the hazards less separated from the software development process. And so that's why I manage my hazards in GitHub Issues, which is the kind of way you would also manage bugs or features in your software. So you're kind of bundling the hazards in with issues and you can link them together and there can be discussion on the same platform between clinicians and technical people, which I think is very valuable. The publication thing, if you hide a clinical safety case, no one can validate that it's been done properly and that the hazards have been mitigated. You're putting a lot of creative writing and you hide it in a SharePoint. And then there is this other layer, which is that if you make it okay to hide the clinical safety case, you will eventually get software suppliers that will either refuse to share the clinical safety case, or in one case I heard about recently, try to charge to see the clinical safety case, which is an absolute scandal. But there's lots of this commercial in confidence and NDA type talk, which is like, well, we know we've got hazards in our software, so we don't want you to go and, talk to anyone about these hazards because that could look bad for us. And the truth of the thing is that all of medicine has hazards and all of software that's used in medicine has hazards. We're not going to judge you for having hazards in software, but we are going to judge you for having hazards that you could have fixed that haven't been fixed. And that's the bit we can't tell when you've got an unpublished hidden clinical safety case. I also like the idea that, we don't have limitless staff, and particularly we don't have limitless clinicians and clinical safety officers. Why would we waste their time to do the same work again and again on similar implementations? We should be able to kind of share and federate the work that's being done. And you get to the point where every possible hazard for a piece of software has already been worked out. And so a new implementer can just take all that work, read it through, make sure nothing's been missed, and attune it for their particular deployment, and then you're good to go, kind of thing. Federating the cases up and down to other organizations. Now, this is super advanced, really, in a way, from where we are now. But it is possible to get things to the stage where you could share these clinical safety cases both downwards and upwards. So if you were a local trust that had done a really good clinical safety case in a pilot setting, and then it gets deployed nationally, you could have your case being adopted nationally. Now, in theory, they could do that with a Word document and a hazard log, but they never do they? Because that's not the way that thought works for people who are using Word documents everywhere. You can't peer review an unpublished thing. I think that's as simple as you can put it. I like the idea that daylight is the best disinfectant, in that when you can see the issues with a thing, there can be open discussion about how to fix them. When you hide it, there's you can't put pressure on somebody to raise standards if you don't know how bad the standards are. I also think, it helps with sharing. Even if you can't federate in a kind of automatic way, you can go and have a look at somebody else's hazards and go, oh yeah, we've got all them. Oh no, they've got one that we haven't. Let's have that one. We'll make sure that's mitigated here as well. Because otherwise it's just kind of you could imagine the same mistakes being repeated across the NHS again and again and again because somebody didn't know about a hazard, and then that hazard happens. And, this is people and their lives that get affected by medical fuck-ups that are caused by our software. This is not without consequence. I think we can do this a whole lot better. And I've been working on some stuff in the past few years that I figured I would sort of share and see what people thought of. So here we go. I want the stuff that makes the software safer. That's really got to be key. Close to the code, evolves with the software, transparent by default, federated up and down between organizations for additional points. And nothing we've got is doing that at the moment. We keep getting promised by NHS England's clinical safety team and various other sort of players in the space that the next thing that they come out with will manage all the software hazards, and we'll have a kind of national database of all the pain points and difficulties and user interface snags and everything. And then we can manage them by, escalating them at the right level. And that, I'm afraid, until someone shows me that working, I consider that to be just fantasy. They don't think they're lying, but they're lying to me, because I can look at them and say, if you can't explain how that's going to happen in a practical sense, then it's just bullshit. And there's been 10 years of bullshit around this process, with nobody taking responsibility for actually saying where is the national database of all the hazards about a piece of software. What I'm proposing here actually could evolve into that national database, and we would have proper, transparent dialogue about every hazard in every piece of software. And the software would get better, because there's nothing stronger than a public hazard that's bright red, glowing radioactively, with 150 clinician comments below it saying, this is frankly dangerous and someone's going to die until this is fixed. And then suddenly the software gets fixed. Whereas handling that in a closed process inside a trust means that you can be told, you're the only one who's ever complained about this. Are you sure it's not just you? Being a bit pernickety, Mr. Clinical Safety Officer at one trust. And they can say that to 150 different trusts and not fix the problem. Much more difficult when it's public. And this is only the same process we have for like all of science. You don't get to start doing clinical procedures on, surgical procedures on people without having published something about the safety of that surgical procedure. If you just start doing it, I think you'd be out on your ear from the profession quite quickly. So this is what got me off on all this journey. I was the clinical safety officer for the RCPCH digital growth charts, and I decided I was not going to do the Word document thing, because we didn't have Word documents for anything else in the project. What we did have was Git repos on GitHub, and we had websites. So I used a very simple documentation framework called Material for Make Docs. And although this is a very pretty looking web page, the source for all this is literally just a folder full of text files in a format called Markdown, which gives us a little bit of formatting in there. And it adds all this lovely, nice sort of colored boxes and things like that, and headings and scrolling and navigation. All of that pretty much comes from the framework. But it meant that in the clinical safety tab, which as you can see along the blue bar, I've got all the different tabs of the different bits of documentation about this project. Clinical safety is just one aspect of that. And I thought, I'm just going to put it on the internet. So my clinical risk management system is on the internet. And I'll publish the link to this presentation and everything that I discuss in it, including this work, in the description of the YouTube video. But long story short, you can see I've got my clinical safety case report, hazard logs, which are managed in GitHub issues. I've got DTAC, medical device registration, because this project is a medical device. All of that stuff just out there. And when somebody says, can I see your clinical safety case? I'm like, yep, it's at this URL. And they just go and they can do what they like with it. They can even download it as a PDF if they damn well want, because I put a button in there that downloads the whole website as a PDF for the people who absolutely must have a document to put in a SharePoint. So Git is for version control. It also controls the attribution. So each atomic change and edit, even if it's just one character's change, you can see that version and you can see that it was attributed to the author of that change. GitHub is just a platform for sharing a Git repository, but it also adds a few features like using issues for the hazards. So my hazards have a standard format and they're just in the GitHub issue. And there's a template for that. So if you want to create a new hazard, there's pre-filled fields, which are loosely the same fields that were in the Excel spreadsheet, but they're in a GitHub issue. And then you fill in all of that. But importantly, you can now have the discussion around it. So there could be plentiful discussion about the magnitude of this hazard and what you've done to mitigate that hazard. Markdown is the content, so we're not tied to like any particular technology like a Word document. Material for Make Docs is a static site framework which is free and open source, didn't cost me anything. And then it's all published on GitHub Pages, which didn't cost me anything. So that none of this actually cost anything to get from a empty repository to a public clinical safety case that I think is quite good. There's always going to be some improvements to be made. And of course, if you go and have a look and see if I've made any mistakes, then do let me know and I'll be able to update them and our clinical safety case gets that little bit better. Because I have other projects, I thought I might need to use this again in the future myself. And I did end up needing to do other clinical safety work. So I thought, great, I'll make a template for this. So I took all the bits out of that website you've just seen and I made them into a template repository. That template repository is at the blue link in the middle of this page, but in essence, it gives you one click to create your own copy of a clinical safety management file. So like if I click on that link, this is where it takes you to. And if you use this template, create a new repository, and that's it. You've now got a clinical safety management file, make docs template of your own. I'll go back to the slides because I've already demonstrated some of this stuff in screenshots. So what's happening in the template is that these things in red rectangles here are a Ginger 2 templating language. And that just means double curly braces. Anything in those double curly braces is a kind of variable that can be replaced by software. So we can change the variables here there's just one file and one place where you go in and fill in the author's email, the author's name, the license. In my case, I wanted to make sure that there was a Creative Commons license on the clinical safety management file, but you don't have to do that. And you work your way through all these bits of information, some of which are optional, some of which are not. And these variables will then get filled in so that when we go back to the published site, so this is the same thing, material for Make Docs now, but published from my template, it's filled in clinical safety team name instead of those Ginger 2 curly braces things. So we've now, with really just the template repository, make a copy, go into one file, fill in the templating names, and then go to GitHub Pages and publish it, you are now live with a website full of your clinical risk stuff. Now, of course, this is only the start. There's loads of stuff in here that is not relevant to you. For example, if you're not a medical device, you don't need this medical device section. So you just go in and remove that from the nav. And there's a certain learning curve to doing this, but it's fairly straightforward. And you'll find that quite quickly, you've got an acceptably good template of your clinical safety case. And that's when the process starts. That's when you start looking at the software and saying, what are the hazards? What are the things that we need to make sure are done so that it is going to be safe? And you write those into the plan. So this is like our process of how we do safety. And then the hazards are tracked in the hazard log. You can do them anywhere. You can put them in Markdown as well, or you can put them in GitHub Issues or something else. But importantly, this makes it much easier to get it out there publicly. A lot of this is doing what I've been doing for my entire career, which is going and looking at what the rest of the tech world does and then doing that in healthcare. So your developers are using Git. They have source control in GitHub. They have some way to flag issues. Let's just use them for clinical safety, right? And that is basically what this is. The federation thing takes it to the next level though. So for clinical safety officers, it is incredibly wasteful of their time to be redoing a clinical safety case that has almost certainly been done multiple times across the NHS. So what would be great is if somebody else has done a local clinical safety case, someone else in your ICB has done a clinical safety case. You could then federate that up to the region, which is sort of ICB level, and they could share it with everybody else locally so that in that region, you've all got the same clinical safety case. And then maybe you've refined that so that now everybody's got the same but really good clinical safety case with everybody's hazards on there and all the mitigations, and it's all agreed so that everybody's got the same mitigations. And then you could also find that could be shared nationally, so that then there's a single national clinical safety case that covers a piece of software that can be used everywhere. Now, you always still need to specialize it for your local area because you're going to have like different clinical safety officers, and there is still a requirement to have a clinical safety case like an 0160 clinical safety case for deployment. But it'd be great if you could take something that's already been ratified by national and regional levels and say, right, we know this is pretty dead on. Is there anything that we need to add because it's local, anything special to us? Yes, no, add it, don't add it. And then you're done, kind of thing. Problem with all this is that it's too techy for most people. And so I've arrived at this because I'm a software developer as well as a clinical safety officer. But I can imagine people thinking this is just absolutely impossible. And they'd be right that there's a very steep learning curve to a lot of this. I think some things have happened in the past decade or so to make Git more accessible. So, for example, there is Git and GitHub have a graphical user interface, which they didn't have 10 years ago so much. And there are tools that can help you do this, not least of which is LLMs in code tools. So VS Code with GitHub Copilot, for example, can make it very easy for you to interact with a Git tracked repository almost in natural language. And you get to experience all the benefits of essentially creating these websites and everything's in Markdown, but without having to understand what, Git remote add origin means or any of that kind of stuff. And some of the code tools the LLM tools will actually do the GitHub stuff for you. Like Claude Code, for example, is very good at using the GitHub CLI tool. So it can kind of do that for you. But it is too techy. I am sorry. So I am working on ways to make it less techy. I think it needs to be wrapped in an easier layer so that the end user would not see any of the technical stuff that I've just explained. I've explained the technical stuff and how it works because I want you to know that it's not magic. A national clinical safety platform is possible, but you can't do it through wishing. You have to do it through building. So it can be built. This is how you would do it. It still gives you transparency, still gives you public accountability, doesn't cost 250 million quid from Accenture, because you can do this with virtually free infrastructure. But what you want is a layer over the top of that is point and click and just makes it super easy to start from a blank canvas or start from a template that's already customized to the software you're using and share these within a platform. And so essentially that is what I'm working on. So myself and another 4 colleagues, we have started to work on something we call turva, which is the Finnish word for safety. And we believe that this will be a simple and affordable layer on top of all that gubbins that I've just talked about, which will make it possible to use Git, GitHub, all those kind of things as a layer for your clinical safety platform. And because we'll be able to optimize it for clinical safety. So essentially it will assist you with the compliance. And we want to make it so that the boring bits are done instantly with no work. And then the difficult bit, you've got all your time for. The difficult bit is deciding what is hazardous about your piece of software, checking to see whether anyone else has that hazard. So that's one thing that inside Turva, we can do the federating thing and make it so that you can see what other people's hazard logs have got on them. It will mean that if there is an unmitigated hazard from a supplier who's essentially decided they don't want to fix their software, we can all see that hazard's not being fixed, and that can help us use our kind of weight of numbers and the strength in numbers to put pressure on a supplier to say, no, you really are going to have to fix that issue. And it will also mean that really safe software will be obviously really safe, and it won't be a question of have you missed a hazard and have you not really thought about it properly. If the consensus across the whole NHS is that everybody's looked at this and says, yeah, it's probably quite safe, not really much that can go wrong, then good software will come across as safe, which rewards good citizens. in the world of health tech software. So we're not ready at all with Toolvar. It's very early days, but I just wanted to flag that that's kind of a product that we're going to put around this. There will be a free tier, because we believe that there should always be a way of getting hold of the best tools. And of course, all of the stuff I've described up to this point is all free. Everything is open source that I do. Toolvar will be open source as well, but most people are going to want to pay for a hosted version because not everybody wants to self-host their software. But yeah, that's the kind of size of it. Hopefully I haven't been too boring, because this is an unusual, it's not like my usual channel chats where I'm doing a kind of bit of Marcus talking to somebody else who's much more interesting. This has been just me droning on about clinical safety, which is kind of an acquired taste. But if you've stuck with me this far, thank you very much. And I will see you on the next one. I think the final word can just be that I made this with reveal.js. This is a presentation framework that I use, and I also made a template for that. So create new reveal.js is a template that helps you make quick templates of reveal.js slides. So thank you very much, and see you in the next video.